Alright, guys, today we're going to be reacting to Andrew Wilson versus feminist debate. What is really oppression? Let's jump in.
Disagree that patriarchy is oppression.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you think that oppression exists? Do you think that people are oppressed in the world?
Depends on how we want to relay what is oppression. So is oppression just not having the entitlement of rights? Is that just what oppression is? Or is oppression that some people have other rights than other people do?
I mean, my original definition of oppression didn't stand because I couldn't define justice, but I would say...
Well, justice is super hard to define, so I'm not beating you up about that.
No, I know. I think that I would say it's keeping one group from being able to exercise their will in a way that another group is not kept in that position. So one group can't do the same thing. They can't exercise free will the way another group can. I think that would be oppression.
To exercise free will in the same way that another group can.
Yeah, sure. You are not able to do that.
Can you exercise your free will the same way that Congress can?
No.
Are they oppressing you?
Well, I mean, maybe. Honestly, it does. I think that form of like government
because otherwise
does imply some form of oppression.
Well, then ultimately, wouldn't you have to advocate for some kind of bizarre utopian ideology where everybody is completely equal? There's no leadership. There's no government. There's no nothing. Wouldn't that ultimately be?
Think about that. Even if you pay a little bit of attention, it's at least try to, imagine certain world like that. Utopia where there's no leader, but who in the hell is going to hold the utopia together? There has to be some kind of hierarchy. Yeah, that's where you end up with communism.
What your goal would have to be then?
No, that's fair. Yeah.
And that's it. That doesn't sound like that's what you want.
No, not particularly.
Yeah. So if we move it back, then maybe we can come up with a different form of oppression.
I think it's difficult to I'm not sure what the dictionary definition of oppression is, but so
if you've got your phone, I don't care if you look it up. If you want to have a working definition, we can go off of. Okay.
But so men being able to, whenever they would like, over women, whether they choose to or not, is not oppression to you. You don't think that constitutes the oppression of women. Men being able to...
No, it's an entailment of their ontology. So they're able...
Well, yeah, but I mean...
They are able to make a distinction and say that the what you are and what they are different. And them applying physical force to their aims is the same thing that you appeal to. So if that's true, I don't see how they're oppressing you. What you're trying to do actually would be the oppressive thing, right? Because you want to take them and have them enforce your will.
I mean, I think that it would be, there's an unequal amount of force there.
There
and I
is,
think that was
but that's baked into the pie of what is,
just because it's baked in, that could still be oppression, right?
I don't see how it's oppressive for men to move into men's interest and understand that force, that they have a monopoly on force. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be benevolent towards women. But that doesn't mean that they have to give them equality either, nor that not giving them equality means that they're oppressed. I don't see how that's oppression.
And that's a good point. That's a great point. But think about this. Even in today's system, right, how guys are not even guided by male figures. Since you're in school, all the way to college is all female driven. So even that concept of the monopoly in force is not even brought up, or you cannot even acknowledge it until later in life when you detach yourself from the system itself. This concept of the monopoly in force, I just start really digging in my 30s. Well, think about it. The fact that we just giving them rights, make no sense.
Unless we're using, at least not by your, well, I guess by your definition it would, but basically everything would be. Like if you and I don't have the same tattoo parlor, I guess that would be oppression because it's unequal.
No, I'm not saying, I'm saying that would be the outcome. The cause of oppression would be the exertion of force that leads to one group not being able to exert, the same amount of rights, exert.
Then we're just back to force
way.
again. So then what it's really a fight about is force. Is that feminism really,
Good
is
point.
you wanting to use the force of the patriarchy to attack itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of inevitable. I don't think that disproves, like, the goal of feminism or
Yeah, but why
makes it
should they do
useless.
that?
Okay, we're getting into the meat
Why
and
should they?
potato.
I mean, I guess women's self-interest. If men have a self-interest to exert their will and, use their biological strength over women, then can you not say that women have a vested interest in pushing back against that and trying to claim some kind of autonomy, some kind
You
of
could say
entitlement
that,
outside
but
of
you're
that?
going to end up with this problem, which is if that's true and it's just a game of force between the sexes with the weaker sex attempting to utilize the stronger sex to enforce their rights, then you would have no complaints if you're trying to utilize force for your aims for them to use force for theirs. And if that's the case, then you're at a huge disadvantage if they ever decide we're going to, because your moral argument goes out the window. And the reason that women and feminism has been so bad for them in the vote is because they used to have a moral high ground, and now they're a political tool because they have to use force. They have to use force for their political ideology, and they never had to before the vote. But now that they're involved in politics, they're literally voting on force doctrine because that's what law is.
So it sounds like women are at a disadvantage in politics.
Well, it sounds like if you really wanted them to not be at a disadvantage, you would remove them from politics because then they could have an actual moral argument.
But I mean,
Damn.
how can you say you're not at a disadvantage in politics if you're not a part of politics at all? You're not advantaged or disadvantaged.
Well, no, they were a part of politics. It's just that they didn't have the right to vote. So they still had women's issues: clean air, clean water, education, health. There was all sorts of women's issues, but they would make moral justifications for those issues, and they had a moral high ground because they weren't appealed to as a voting bloc. For instance, 1920.
Yeah, that's a good point. So they still have some kind of power, right? But the only difference was that they didn't have that power of the vote. So even though they were, how can I say this? So instead of going through the emotional landscape, they have to go through more logical landscape. We need clean water. We need clean. Yeah, it was more practical compared to now, which is very impractical. We have a lot of ambiguous, subjective terms and problems, right? We're not dealing with problem because literally that's the essence of the female nature. So it makes sense.
That's the 19th Amendment. Okay, that was never voted on. There was no referendum by women for their own vote. Now imagine the irony. The irony of women getting the right to vote, but they refuse to actually allow them to vote on it.
Yeah, I mean, it is ironic. I would agree.
It's not only ironic, but the reason that they didn't want them to vote on it is because everywhere that they tried those referendums, women voted against it because they didn't want to be political tools, because they knew that they would have to utilize a force doctrine of men. So they would have to vote that men enforce whatever their will was. That's why they didn't want it. That was one of the primary anti-suffragette arguments. And so that's why. That's why when I look at egalitarianism and equality, I see it as a great evil. Because I see people who basically want to appeal and utilize force against these various groups in order to enforce their will because they can't enforce it themselves.
I mean, I guess I don't see how that makes it evil. It sounds like you don't really think that the use of force is necessarily evil, or the threat of force is necessarily evil.
No, then neither do you. Because
No.
you've just said 1,000 times that you'll utilize it to get whatever it is that you want.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's evil. I think that.
But I think a doctrine.
So why is egalitarianism evil?
Well, because egalitarianism is trying to convince women that they're equal to men, while at the same time they have to appeal to men for their equality.
Think about that. You're so equal that you have to depend of the other party. You're so equal, but you have to depend. It's the most backward thing to think about. We're so equal, but at the same time, we're not equal as long. We need the other party to just enforce our rights. It's very crazy, folks. And to be honest, I never thought about these concepts until recently, in the last couple of years, 4 or 5 years. A lot of these stuff start, popping up in the web, and there's a mission here. And I'm thinking about the future of my kids and my family, and you know, and it's okay to discuss these kind of topics because they're very complex. They're not they're complex, but at the same time, when you get to the meat and the grinder, it's very simple.
So not only a contradiction, but it's insanity because it ultimately sets them up for failure, believing that they're equal with a patriarchal system, which could at any time take away whatever their perception is of equality. They can just overnight gone, and there's not really anything women can do about it. It's insane to me to think that a bunch of rich industrialists were able to convince women, and they didn't even really convince them. They convinced congressmen, which is how you got the 19th. But a bunch of rich industrialists convinced women that they were best served being men, and they're not. They're not best served being men. They're not best served out in the workforce. That's not their function. Never really.
Well, I think that the concept of force is very interesting because it's one of those topics that has been brought up to the table to really, really, really have a serious conversation of, do we need to keep this visage that we are equal, or are we going to be honest? Because if they cannot enforce their own rights, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to let them have the same equal amount of power. Simple as that. Because if we have a female president with a female vice president, and the majority of the Senate females, and the majority of the House is female, but then when it comes down to award, it's all men. How is that correlate to the extension of power? It doesn't. Let me know what you guys see in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one.